Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is David Glasser, who is a Grammy Award-winning mastering engineer who runs Airshow Mastering based out of Boulder, California. He's best known for his work with the Grateful Dead, with whom he's mastered tons of records for. He's also done a bunch of work for Smithsonian Folkways and some other really cool projects as well, which we get into in this episode. In today's episode, we dive deep into David's mastering process, and we also get into a really interesting topic, which is his work doing archival restoration and dealing with tracks that have been recorded on old analog tape systems or old formats that have tons of noise and clicks and pops and stuff like that, and restoring those so that they can sound really clean. And David has actually been using some really, really cool cutting edge technology to get his masters sounding really clear. And we dive into all of that. It's really interesting stuff. And I think it's really interesting because most people, when they think about getting into audio engineering, they think about recording or mixing work. Some people think about editing, but when we're talking about editing, most people think about, pitch correction or time correction, that kind of stuff. But this audio restoration side of things is a really interesting service that a lot of people could offer. There is a bunch of work to do in this kind of field, and it goes much deeper than any of that other editing stuff I just talked about. It goes into really getting to removing noise and clicks and pops, which some people might be familiar with. But when you hear David talk about this plangent system that he uses, it takes this to a whole new level. It really gets into understanding tape noise and knowing what causes all of these weird issues, especially with analog tape. So yeah, we get into David's process for that. I think it's really, really fascinating. And we get into his work with the Grateful Dead, and we talk about also mastering live records and some of the challenges that come along with that versus studio albums, or even remastering old classic albums. And especially when you're dealing with a client like the Grateful Dead, you've got a lot of old records that people know really well and love. So, how do you approach remastering those projects so that you're preserving the sound that people are familiar with? So in this episode, we definitely dive into all of that stuff as well. So with that said, I think this is a really interesting one. So let's just jump right into it. David Glasser, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going today, man?
It's going good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. For people who might not be familiar with you, can you give us that background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into all this cool stuff you're working on today?
I'm a mastering engineer exclusively, although my background is in other aspects of the audio world. But yeah, I've been mastering since 1990, pretty much exclusively mastering. Got my start, like a lot of people, at my college radio station back in the day. And from there, went on to work at a classical radio station. And that station was involved with recording and syndicating the Boston Symphony and Boston Pops orchestras. So I was able to get into that world a little bit, and eventually did some recording at Symphony Hall in Boston of the Pops and the Symphony. That was an incredible opportunity and incredible experience. I did a lot of remote recording in the day for big events, a lot of jazz, classical. I worked for National Public Radio in Washington, D.C. for 8 years, was a staff engineer and worked on all the news shows, but was mainly involved with music production and music recording there. So that's my background, basically.
Nice. So was the plan always to get into radio or recording, or like where did the mastering part of it come into to play?
I never had a plan. Things just happened as they happen. I sort of got into mastering by accident. Well, not by accident, but just back in, when was it? Back in the 80s, I bought a Sony F1 system. I don't know if you remember those. It was one of the early digital recording systems that piggybacked digital audio on a video carrier and recorded on a beta videotape. They were super convenient. You can get like 3 hours of recording on a tape. It was such a great thing to have after lugging reel-to-reel tapes and a rack of Dolbys out on location. And this was all 2-track work that I was doing. Anyway, those F1 tapes didn't sound as good as we believed at the time that they sounded, but they were convenient, but you couldn't really do much with them. You couldn't edit them. So I sort of got one of the very, very early Digidesign editing systems. It's called Sound Tools. and started working with that. And that eventually led to mastering records. And I expanded what I was doing. I got a Sony 1630 system. I got a Sonic Solutions workstation. And I was in the mastering business. And it was a good time to start in that. I did not start at a place or at a time when cutting lacquers was a thing. So I kind of missed out on that. But working with the early digital systems was really great. And I built up a nice clientele doing that.
Nice. So as far as the mastering side of things goes, was that all kind of self-taught at that point then, I guess?
Yeah, primarily. Although there were people that I looked up to, that I followed, that I would try and learn about. So a lot of trial and error, a lot of following what some of the people I admired were doing. I kind of made a decision back then that I wouldn't do it on the cheap. I would do it right. Oh gosh, even back then, I hired John Storick to do some acoustic work in my control room. I had Paul Wolf build me a small little mastering console.
You just went all in.
I did, yeah, and here I am.
Love it. Well, I'd love to.
Later.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to dive into your process a little bit, and I'm curious to know, like, what's your mindset when you first start a new project? What do you typically like? Where do you start? What are you listening for? What's the goal? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a whole bunch of things. If it's a project that I know absolutely nothing about, then the first thing is to listen and to talk with the client about what they're after, what their process was, what they're going for. Projects that are from engineers or producers or artists that I've worked with for a long time, I kind of know what to expect. And I know what they're going after. But yeah, the first thing is to listen, to sort of get in your mind's ear. Well, get inside of the client's head. What were they going after? What did they get exactly right? What did they miss a little bit? And fill in those gaps. At this point, I've been doing it long enough that that's just sort of instinctual. Eventually you get into that mindset where you hear something and you can kind of parse where it should go.
And so when you're listening to a master like that and you're trying to figure out where that client's vision is for it, yeah, I guess with a new client, you're probably having a lot of conversations as to like how they feel about the mix and going off of that. But I'm assuming a lot of it too is just kind of like maybe listening to the mix itself and figuring out, okay, well, these are maybe the loudest elements of the track and kind of basing it off of that kind of thing, right?
Well, by the time it comes here, it's a stereo mix, excluding surround and Atmos for the moment. So it really doesn't matter if it's a solo flute recording or a full-on rock recording. It's a stereo mix. That's the music, and how should that be presented? If there's something in a mix that's really weird or doesn't sound right, then that's a conversation with the client. And it may be that's what they're going for, or it may be that they're like, well, yeah, I think you're right. So maybe a little tweak or a remix is in order before we dive into the mastering. But communication is key. Making sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing and making sure that I'm working with the best possible source, and it's all in service of the final product.
Absolutely. As far as your workflow, I mean, like you said, you've been at this now for over 35 years. I'm sure you've established your workflow and got it pretty well under control at this point. Do you have a specific workflow that you like to work with as far as, maybe order processing, that kind of thing?
Most of the things that I do start off digital, of course, because that's what everybody's doing these days. They start off digital, but I'll use analog processing. I'll use digital processing. Pretty much always a combination of analog and digital. And boy, I have a lot of the same equipment that I've been using for a long time, for like 20 years or so. I'm using the same stuff. So I know what it does. I also know that there's usually nothing new under the sun, that these tools are tried and true. And if you can't make a good record using them, then you really have to rethink it.
For sure. Now, as far as like when it comes to like your processing chain or your signal chain there, like do you typically have a certain order of things that you like to work with there?
Yeah, in some ways, have a nice mastering console. That's the heart of the studio, with a lot of switchable inserts. I'll try out lots of things first. I'll spend a lot of time on the first tune if it's an album, and try out different combinations of equalizers, compressors, different order of processors, and then spend a lot of time unplugging the things that are just not working and come up with the 2 or 3 tools that are gonna do the job. And if an album was made in one time, mixed by the same guy, then that's gonna usually serve as a template for the whole album. And like I said, combination of analog and digital. I'm not a big plug-in guy, but I do use certain plugins that I know and I like. Yeah, mostly analog with digital stuff on top of that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, a couple of things to take from that I think are interesting. One of them is that you said you'll find the 2 or 3 things that you'll use in your processing chain, which I think is important for people to catch on to. It's like, that doesn't sound like much, you know?
It's not. And if you could see the console that I'm sitting in front of right now, there's lots of stuff in there. There's 4 analog equalizers, there's 4 analog compressors, there's some digital gear, and then there's all the stuff in the computer. And I see people post online all the shit that they use to master a record, and I'm thinking, God, why do you have 4 equalizers and 3 compressors on that song? I remember reading that Doug Sachs, the great Doug Sachs of the Mastering Lab, he basically used 1 equalizer. It was a custom equalizer, and 1 tube limiter. And he used that on just those 2 things on most of the records that he did. I thought, well, that says something there. Less is more.
Of course. Yeah, I love that. That's a great way to look at it for sure. Well, it's interesting too, because you also said that you still use a lot of analog equipment. And I was reading an article with you where you talked about getting into digital very early. And in that interview, you had mentioned getting into the Sony F1, which you mentioned earlier. And you had said that at that time, it was really about convenience at that point, like to have that option out there, even though it wasn't necessarily the best sounding. And I think that like these days, a lot of people get into digital because of its convenience factor as well, the recall and all that kind of stuff. But yet, despite all of that, you're saying that today you still use a lot of analog gear. And so I'm curious to know, like, what situations do you prefer using analog versus digital, and when do you make that decision to go plug-in route versus hardware units?
Well, not all the digital stuff that I use is plugins. I use hardware digital too. There are some equalizers that I have that have a character to them, Pultex, API, and sometimes that's perfect, but other times it adds too much of a signature onto the sound that you don't want. So you want something cleaner. Maybe that's an analog EQ like a Massenburg, or maybe it's a nice digital equalizer like Weiss or even like Ozone plugin or something like that. It just depends, and everything works together. So you can't really isolate what one piece of gear is doing. It's how everything works in concert. How the equalizer is affecting what the compressor is doing, what a limiter is adding to the sound. So you have to approach it as a holistic operation.
For sure. Yeah, every piece of gear is going to have its own character that it's adding to the mix, whether it's analog or digital. So I guess it's really just about understanding those tools enough to know when some sort of plug-in or whatever is going to work better than your analog limiter, or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. It makes sense there.
Yeah.
Another thing that I was curious to dig into with you is that you do a lot of like catalog restoration and archival work, and it sounds like maybe that kind of stemmed from those days of when you were getting into mastering and cleaning up those F1 tapes and stuff. I think that's an interesting field to dive into, because I think it's a service that a lot of people don't even realize is a service they can offer, is that cleanup thing. And there's certainly a lot of work to do with that stuff, whether it's old archival stuff, or I've even heard of people using it for like forensic audio and stuff like that too. So there's a lot of really interesting things that can come from that. So what does that process typically look like for you when it comes to doing those archival things?
Boy, it depends. Let's see. When I first started out, I did a lot of work for Smithsonian Folkways Records, and they have a a huge archive of recordings going back into the 50s. Very early on, you had to have the capability of, or I had to have that capability of being able to clean up those old recordings. I got a Sonic Solutions no noise system in 1991, I think, and it was $21,000 for the 3 cards that made up the no noise system in an Apple computer, and that was a lot of money. But I tell you, that paid for itself in a year.
Well, I was going to say, if you're going to put in that much money into a system like that, then there's obviously got to be the return on the other side of that you can anticipate, right?
Always, and that's a big consideration with anything that I purchase or think about using. See, back to the restoration stuff. Lately, I've been doing the 50th anniversary releases of all the Grateful Dead albums, as well as a bunch of the Grateful Dead live stuff. But with that, we've been using a process called plangent, which, let's see, to get a little bit technical, the reason that analog tape works as well as it does is something called bias, which is a very high frequency signal that's added to the audio, and it forces the tape to operate in its most linear, lowest distortion range. There's a guy named Jamie Howarth and his company Plangent Processes. He's figured out a way to recover that bias from an analog recording and use it to correct any speed variation in the recording, in the analog recording. And that could be microscopic speed fluctuations that you hardly notice, if at all, or real problems like wow and flutter that you can't hear. So we've been using that as part of the tape restoration process, and to me that's one of the coolest developments in decades.
So it's not like a time code thing when we're talking about this bias, right? It's not something that like is audible to most people, right?
Oh no, it ranges in frequency depending on the tape recorder from around 90 kilohertz up to 450 kilohertz for an Ampex ATR. It's a signal that is there because it makes the recording work, but it was never designed to do anything other than that. It was never designed to be recovered after the recording was made, and most tape recorders have a bias trap to actually filter that out when you play the tape back. But turns out it's a valuable marker to kind of recover what the signal was on its way into the tape recorder, if that makes sense.
So it's kind of like evening out the speed of the tape so that you're getting that clean, unaffected sound.
And it's not only evening out the speed. One of the things that you get in tape recording is scrape flutter. It's from the tape vibrating a little bit in between the tape guides, and that adds distortion sidebands to the signal. Well, if you eliminate that flutter, then you eliminate those sidebands. You eliminate distortion from the recording, distortion that was induced mechanically and not electronically.
Not through gain. Yeah. That's very fascinating. Like,
which is pretty cool.
I'm assuming a lot of that is like very minor stuff, but it all adds up over time, like, with everything else in the chain.
It can be really dramatic. Remember, I had a Doc Watson recording, the great Doc Watson flat pick guitar player, one of the giants of American music. This was a live recording, and I did the transfer, and it didn't sound very good. It was real, the recording sounded really harsh. And I thought, that's kind of a disappointment because it's a cool performance. I sent the transfers to Jimmie to do his plangent thing, and they came back sounding really, really nice and smooth. And I was floored. I talked to him about it, and he said, "Well, yeah, that's because all the scrape flutter being removed from the recording."
So I guess some people would say, like, well, isn't that the sound of analog that everyone like loves? Is like the sound of the tape and everything that comes along with it. But
there are sounds and characteristics of analog tape that we do love. How it overloads, how it adds harmonic richness and things like that. But that has nothing to do with wow and flutter and scrape flutter distortion and those kind of things. So you remove the bad stuff and you're left with the nice things that tape can do.
That's very fascinating. Yeah, it's like I guess it would be just you're getting like a higher resolution of that original sound, and there's none of that other tape stuff in the mixer.
You're getting pretty much what the engineer artist and producer was hearing when the signal was going to the tape that they were all excited about.
For sure. Well, it's interesting too, because like with a lot of those restoration tools, they sometimes can impart their own sound or artifact, I guess you might want to call it. Like I know like a lot of like noise reduction systems, you know, they're going to remove some top end and that kind of stuff. So how do you go about making decisions regarding like how far to take the noise removal and restoration side of things without losing the original character of that, you know, that mix?
It's just being real careful. You could cross that line pretty easy where you do get audible artifacts or you do lose something about the recording that was special. So you just have to know when to back off. And a little tape hiss never hurt anybody. So, you know, I'm usually on the conservative side when it comes to using tools like that.
Fair. And people are kind of used to hearing that tape hiss anyway, so they wouldn't know better, you know, whether it was there or not, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Aside from the plangent system, are there any other tools that you like to use for the restoration side of things?
What everybody else is using, I use Isotope, which does some amazing things. I'm a dinosaur. I'm still using Soundblade from Sonic Studio, which was what the old Sonic Solutions became. And of course, it's an obsolete program and it won't run on modern operating systems, but no noise tools in Soundblade, I don't think can be beat. You could remove crackle and clicks and things like that directly on the sound file. You don't have to render the sound file afterwards, and you could undo those changes anytime you want. And I don't think anybody else has that. And Sonic Solutions has had it for 35 years, so I don't know what to say.
You're still recouping from that investment of the system, the no noise system back in the day.
Well, that system is long gone, but yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, I'm sure as a mastering engineer, you've probably seen your fair share of mixes come to you that have noise issues, whether it's noise, clicks, pops, that kind of thing. What advice do you have for people who are maybe in that recording or editing, mixing stage in order to make sure that all that stuff is kind of taken care of before it even comes to you?
Well, one thing I would say is, to people who are sending their mixes off to mastering or doing anything with them, is before you send a mix off to be mastered, listen to it. And make sure that there's nothing weird about it. I'll get calls after I've mastered some stuff, and the client will say, well, we left out a guitar part, so I have to send you a new mix. And I'm thinking, well, why didn't you listen to the mix before you sent it to me, rather than assume that your workstation it is doing what you think it's doing. Of course, a big part of the mastering side is quality control. I'm probably the last human that's going to listen carefully to the music before it's pressed or released digitally. Every master gets a quality control listen on headphones. You pretty much always find some stuff, a little random click or something that you could easily take out that you missed during the heat of the session. But I think the same thing has to happen with mixers. You have to know that what you're sending out is what you think it is.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's because people are just like using offline bounce mode most of the time and they're not even hearing the final bounce as it goes out?
Well, there's nothing wrong with offline bounce. It's really convenient, but no matter how you create your mix, you should listen to it. Yeah. Don't assume that the technology is not going to bite you in the ass, because it will.
Yeah. It's so easy to have something routed to the wrong place. And yeah, even if you are real time bouncing it, you still might hear it, but it's not being exported to the track that you need it to be, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, definitely do your due diligence and follow up and listen to this stuff before it sends out, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No one's in that big of a rush that it's literally from DAW to mastering like that, You can listen to it for a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, earlier you had mentioned that you've been doing a bunch of work for the Grateful Dead, and I was curious to get into that as well. You've obviously mastered a ton of stuff for them, and you've even mastered a lot of live recordings of theirs as well, which I think is really cool. And I'm curious to get into that. Like, what would you say are some of the main differences when it comes to mastering a live record versus something that's been done in the studio?
It depends. With the Grateful Dead stuff, the vast majority of their live recordings are stereo board mixes or stereo recordings that were made with a separate console but direct to stereo. So there's no multi-track. So there's probably going to be some mix issues. A lot of those shows, the first 2 or 3 songs, they're still getting the mix together. Something that we don't appreciate now because, boy, the live sound technology has become so great that you expect that when you go to a show, it's going to sound fabulous from the first song to the end. But back when everything was analog with no recall or anything, often the first song or two you were getting the mix together. So there's that issue. There's things that inevitably happen with a live mix where maybe the channel balance is not always correct. Certain elements may be too loud or too soft. Noises, distortions, all those issues that you have to deal with.
For sure. So obviously, like a big part of mastering, especially when you're dealing with like an album, would be that you're creating consistency from song to song. In the case of a live album where you're dealing with, kind of a beginning to end thing, and you talked about how, maybe the first couple songs, the mix is just kind of getting sorted out. So when it comes to that consistency, how do you go about doing that and creating that consistency from those first songs to the rest of them? Like, are you pushing those first couple tracks maybe a little bit harder to bring out certain elements and do that kind of thing?
I'll usually start with those Grateful Dead shows. I'll start like halfway into the first set where everything is sitting pretty good. And then after I've worked on the whole show from middle of the first set to the end, then I'll go back to the first couple songs and see if I can get those to fall in the same universe as the rest of the show. And I want it to sound like a consistent thing from start to finish because that's what it is. I also want it to sound like a live recording in the type of venue that it was recorded in. So a stadium show, has to have that huge feel, a theater, a little more intimate. You want to preserve those things, which will be evident in the recording.
Mm-hmm. And as far as preserving those things, like, I'm assuming that often with these live recordings, there's been some sort of like crowd mic or something like that that's picking up maybe some of that ambience of the room to maybe provide that. But do you find yourself ever like doing any noise removal and stuff like that, like to try to make things sound a little bit tighter in the mastering process at all, or for like theater shows and that kind of thing?
Nothing consciously. The recording is going to kind of dictate what's needed.
Well, in addition to the live records that you've done for Grateful Dead, you've also done a lot of remaster projects for them as well. And I'm curious to dig into that too. Like, remastering can be a delicate subject when it comes to fans of the band because they're used to hearing things a certain way. So when it comes to remastering, what's your approach there, and how do you balance that idea of like giving people what they already are familiar with versus improving upon it?
Well, you want to respect what the original was, especially if it's not a iconic record. So I'll always reference earlier releases of the record. What I want to do is make it sound better than it did before. And we'll use plangent. I'll tread very lightly on anything that changes that can change the character of the recording. So most of those Grateful Dead records, no compression, no limiting, maybe a touch of limiting. Yeah, mainly EQ and plangent on those Grateful Dead things. Very cool.
Yeah, and I guess even with that, like, I guess goes back to that earlier question of like, how far do you go with the cleanup to make sure that it's doing the job and giving it the fidelity it needs, but also like still preserving some of that character that people do know these classic albums to have, right?
Yeah. You've got to preserve that. But you've got to make it sound better, or else what's the point?
Fair. So when it comes to doing a lot of these remastering projects, Like, what is the reason why most of these artists are doing these remasters these days? Is it just because they want something that sounds a little bit more modern, or?
Boy, I think in a lot of cases the artist is not involved that much. I think it's the label mostly. And I know that the Rhino Records that handles the Grateful Dead stuff, they really want stuff to sound good. They are real sticklers about that. And it's so great working with them because of that, because that's their mindset. But they've got to make money. So what's the reason for the reissues? They have to monetize the recordings, but in the process, give the fans something that makes it worth spending the money to buy it again for the fourth time.
Mm-hmm. Fair. Yeah, finding new ways to repackage the same things. Well, one of the topics that always seems to be a pretty hot topic when it comes to mastering is the idea of levels. And there's a lot of debate as to, what the right levels are and blah, blah, blah. Earlier, I mentioned that I read an interview with you where you're talking about that Sony system, but also in that same article, you were talking about levels. In there, you were quoted as saying that your version of really loud is not like other people's idea of loud.
And that's still true, yeah.
And I was curious if you can elaborate on that and what that means.
Let's see. Well, because that's something that comes up a lot. Past a certain point, things don't sound loud anymore. They get smaller, almost as you squash them. You've got to find that sweet spot that preserves the dynamics and the impact that gives the music the drive that it has. You have to preserve that, but also make it at a level where it's not lost. I know lots of records now, pop records, they're like, -6 LUFS or something like that. To me, that's insane. For a lot of the music that I work on a lot of acoustic music, which I love. A lot of bluegrass and new kind of combination of bluegrassy, jazz, classical, that world. And I don't want to really put a number on it because you really can't, but it seems like the sweet spot for a lot of that kind of music is like -12 or so, where you've kept the dynamics in the music that make it work. Having said that, it's not my record, so if somebody wants something loud, then they're going to get it loud. It's hard to keep a nice dynamic character, but also make it screaming loud. I don't know if I have any answers, but if I have to, then that's what I'll do.
For sure. But it's interesting too, because like with that style of music, the arrangements are so different than say like a heavier rock track. So -12 might end up sounding louder than some rock tracks that are maybe -8, -10 or something like that, just by the nature of their dynamics and the arrangement anyway. So I think it just does come back to that idea that you were talking about earlier, just like finding out, what is that magic number where you're still preserving those transients and all that detail. Because you could certainly push it, but you're gonna start to get the artifacts of that at some point. So now when it comes to digital streaming these days, like different platforms tend to have different targets that they're kind of all promoting. Do you feel like you end up making different masters for different services, or are you kind of that mindset of like one master to rule them all?
All the services seem to be in that window, -16 to -13, somewhere around there. So if you get it in that range, or even a little hotter than that, then that's fine. But it's going to work on all the platforms. You're really chasing your tail if you think you have to do a separate version for Spotify and a separate one for Apple and a separate one for YouTube. You're not going to make any money. It's going to drive you crazy, and it's just not worth it.
Yeah. Well, you still have like services like Apple that are promoting their Apple Masters and that kind of thing too. So I think some people still think that there is like an advantage with that kind of stuff as opposed to making that one master. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I remember early on when I worked for NPR, one of the things that was kind of drilled into all the engineers was it has to sound good on a hi-fi. It has to sound good in the car, on the radio. It has to sound good on a little kitchen radio, and that it was possible to make one master that translated across all of those playback devices, and it that's no different with the streaming stuff.
Fair. Yeah. So then in your over 35 years of experience doing this, what would you say has changed the most as far as your mastering process or your approach to mastering?
Boy, that's a good question. I know every now and then I'll have to revisit either because the client asks for it, or maybe, I just want to listen. I listen to some older stuff and surprise myself at how good it still sounds. So I think that I was doing something right back then, and hopefully I'm still doing it. But I think the thing that's changed for me mostly is kind of standardizing how I organize projects and how I approach the workflow. And, every project is different, but it's not a truly blank slate. There are things that you can take from your experience and immediately apply it to that, and it's going to be a good starting point. I'm not being flippant or anything, but the work in the mastering room, part of it is being on an assembly line. The stuff comes in, you crank it out, and you push it out the door. You have to have systems that make that as efficient as possible, with still leaving all the room for creativity in there.
Mm-hmm. So what are some ways that you do that?
I have a really, really good database that still has some of the seeds of the first FileMaker program that I wrote like 40 years ago. It's a lot more inclusive now. So I've got everything organized under one program. Contacts, calendars, equipment recall, all that is in one place. The way that I've organized the studio, studio is like a boat. Once you get finished painting it, you have to start painting it again. So you're always tweaking things. And I think I've gotten to a point where I really, really like how everything's working and how everything's organized. I don't even have to think about where to reach to get what I need. So, anybody who's embarking on this, that should be your goal, is ergonomics and efficiency, and get the hardware out of the way to just allow you to sort of automatically get to work.
Mm-hmm. Are you using any sort of templates to get up and running with your sessions?
Yeah. With stereo, it's like fairly basic. With Atmos stuff, which I'm just getting into, that's a whole different thing, where you really, really need templates for organizing your projects. Yeah, but I do have some basic templates that I use. I have all the digital gear, converters, processors, various other stuff. That's all in a Z Systems router with a software control. The Dante stuff, I have templates for that at a push of a button, I could switch between working in various ways. So
yeah, it sounds like you've got everything kind of all at a push of a button, which is pretty handy, especially with like your mastering console and all that stuff too. It just makes it really easy to be efficient with it, rather than patching in a whole bunch of stuff and trying to find files on your computer and all that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I asked you, over the last 35 years, what's changed? What would you say has stayed the same?
The goal of the work is the same, to take a client's mixes, which is that's their baby, that's their dream, and present it in the best possible light. That hasn't changed at all. A lot of the tools that I use, that hasn't changed either. I'm still using a lot of the analog equipment. I'm kind of looking around here at what I've got. That stuff hasn't changed in 20 years. What has changed, the IT infrastructure has changed. It used to be, when people were recording to analog tape and then to DATs, there was a time lag. They had to ship you the tapes, had to align the tape machine. And if there was something that needed to be changed, then that's another week or so maybe before you can get revisions. Now everything's instantaneous. In the middle of a session, I could call up a client and say, on that third song, there's this weird thing, and 10 minutes later, I could have a remix in hand. The time frame that things happen has really contracted, and in a way that's great. In another way, I kind of miss working off of analog tapes. I miss the pause that you had to have when you rewound the tape. You couldn't just hit a space bar and play it again. somebody says, well, I'd like to hear that again. I said, okay, so it takes a couple minutes to rewind the reel, gives you a little time for your head to clear out.
I'm sure too, like it would have also helped with like building relationships with clients too, because if they're in the back of the room, you've now got so much more time to like talk to them, get to know them more,
absolutely.
and like create that relationship too. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, at the end of the day, what in your mind ultimately makes a great sounding master?
Well, it has to start with a great song or a great composition and a great performance. If you have that, then I think your brain is more forgiving of the little imperfections in the recording. But what makes a great master is a presentation that allows you to really get inside of the performance and the song without anything else getting in the way. Of course, that starts with the song and the arrangement and the recording, but also with the mix and the mastering, to enhance those characteristics and not put anything stupid in the way of that. Not destroy that dynamic build between the verse and the chorus and the bridge, to make sure that still comes through.
Absolutely. No, I love that. I think that's a great analogy or like a great example of something to be mindful of in mastering too. Because if you're just pushing for a level, you'll get level, but then you don't realize that maybe you've killed that dynamic shift between key parts of the song and that kind of thing. So it's kind of figuring out what's giving you that energy and excitement of the track, and how to preserve that. Love that. Dave, this has been awesome. I've loved learning more about your processes and your mindset with all this stuff. If people want to learn more about you or maybe even work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Airshowmastering.com is the best way. There's a contact form on the website.
Awesome. I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Of course. Yeah, of course. Well, David, thank you again for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait for people to hear this.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
So that was my episode with David Glasser, and I really enjoyed learning more about the plangent process that he's using for all of his archival and restoration stuff. I just think that's so fascinating that we had this technology back in the day that had this little hidden feature in there, but the fact that we can now use that feature to help us clean up the audio later on just really goes to show you how far technology's come. And I think it's really interesting. And that archival side of things, to me, there's a lot of work in that. And that whole market, to me, just seems like a very untapped market where we have so many old recordings that need to be cleaned up. And also, like David was talking about, like there's a lot of older artists that want to re-release their music and have a newer, improved version of it for people to hear. And so there's a lot of work in that side of things. And I think to really get into understanding the noise removal and getting into all of that restoration side of things, there's definitely a lot of opportunity there. So it was really cool to hear David talk about it and some of the methods that he's using to do so. I even know people who have done it at a forensic level and have clean up audio for police or Department of Defense and stuff like that. Heck, I've even cleaned up like old 911 calls that have tons of noise because people need stuff for legal purposes. Like there's a big market there that I think a lot of people will forget about. So definitely an area to look into if you enjoy that part of the process. I also thought it was interesting to hear David talk about his work with the Grateful Dead and working on live albums. And I thought he brought up a really interesting point of, the first couple songs in the set being a little bit looser in terms of the mix and some of the challenges that go along with that. So I also thought that was an interesting thing to bring up and hear more about some of the ways that he goes about creating consistency on a live album too. So I found that episode really fascinating, and I hope you did too. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about all new episodes as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're currently working on new music and you're struggling to get the sound that you hear in your head, you're struggling to get your recordings to sound clear and polished, or to ultimately get the tones and excitement and energy and polish that you want, that's something I would love to help you out with. And inside of my coaching program, Amplitude, that's exactly what I do. I work one-on-one with my students to help you figure out what the sound is that you're shooting for, and then we reverse engineer that process. We walk through the recording, editing, and mixing process and go step by step to make sure that you're making the right decisions all along the way and that you're implementing everything properly. And as you're implementing, I'm right by your side giving you feedback, giving you support, encouragement, teaching you what to do, and even hopping on calls and mixing with you so that ultimately, in the end, you get that sound that you want to come out of your speakers. So if you're interested in getting one-on-one help with your recordings, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude. And on that page, you can find all the details of the program, but you also find a button where you can hop on a call with me. And I'd love to hop on a call with you to learn more about what you're working on, what's working for you, what's not working for you, where you're struggling with, and to see how I can ultimately help you, if I can. I only work with people in this program who I truly believe I can help. So if I think I can help you, then I'd love to share all the details of the program, and hopefully we can work together. So once again, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com/amplitude to get all the details on that. And with that said, we've reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.